This little beggar girl asks a millionaire to marry her mom. The millionaire is shocked and doesn't understand why. When she reveals the reason, he becomes furious. Leave a comment to help this video and subscribe to support my work. The sky was darkening over the city when Cindy squeezed her mother's feverish hand, feeling the heat radiating from her increasingly hot skin. In their small shack by the riverbank, where the smell of mildew mingled with the putrid odor of the polluted water, the 10-year-old girl watched helplessly as Mary struggled to breathe between bouts of coughing. "Mom, have some more water," Cindy whispered, carefully lifting Mary's head. The woman barely managed to swallow, letting the water dribble down the corner of her mouth. Her eyes, once so vibrant and determined, were now glazed over with fever. Cindy glanced at the empty medicine bottle beside the worn mattress. She had shoplifted that medication from the drugstore 3 days ago, something she never thought she'd do. But desperation had left her no choice. Now even that wasn't working. Her mother was getting worse with each passing hour. "Honey," Mary croaked, "don't cry. Everything's going to be all right." But the words, which should have brought comfort, sounded hollow in the heavy air of the shack. Cindy knew nothing was all right. The burn marks on her mother's arms seemed deeper against her pale skin, scars from a past Mary rarely mentioned. Night fell completely, and with it came another coughing fit. This time Mary began to tremble, her teeth chattering as the fever climbed even higher. Cindy felt panic rising in her chest. She couldn't lose her mother. She was all she had in the world. Desperate, the girl remembered the magazine she had found discarded on the street days ago. Inside, there was a feature on Edward Thompson, the young heir to a hotel chain. Something about his photo had caught her attention. Perhaps the gentle smile, or the way his eyes seemed kind. More importantly, the magazine mentioned he frequented a high-end clothing store downtown. With one last look at her mother, who was now muttering incoherent words in her feverish delirium, Cindy made a decision. She tucked the tattered blankets around Mary and kissed her hot forehead. "I'm going to get help, Mom. I promise I won't be long." She ran through the dark streets of the slum, her bare feet knowing every stone, every pothole in the path. Downtown was miles away, but Cindy didn't think twice. As she ran, the tears dried on her dirty face, swept away by the cold night wind. After nearly an hour of running, she finally spotted the luxurious store. Her heart leaped when she recognized Edward Thompson entering the establishment. It was now or never. The security guards tried to stop her as soon as she approached the entrance, but Cindy was small and agile. She slipped under one of their arms and ran inside the store, ignoring their shouts of protest. "Please," her voice echoed through the quiet, elegant space. "Marry my mother. If you don't help, she's going to die." Time seemed to freeze. Edward Thompson turned slowly, his eyes wide as he stared at the small figure before him. For a moment, Cindy saw something flicker across his face, surprise, confusion, and then guilt. "Get this kid out of here," he ordered the guards, his cold voice cutting through the air like a knife. But as the men grabbed her arms, Cindy kept shouting, "Please! She has a very high fever. She needs help. I saw your picture. I know you're a good person." As she was dragged outside, Cindy managed to shout the address of the shack where she lived. She saw Edward Thompson look away, but something in his posture had changed. He seemed tense, disturbed. The guards left her on the sidewalk with a stern warning never to return. Cindy stood there for a few minutes, tears now flowing freely down her face. She had failed. Her last hope had been ripped away from her like everything else in her life. With a heavy heart, she began the long walk back home. With each step she imagined her mother alone, burning with fever on the old mattress. What if she got even worse while she was gone? What if... Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a luxury car passing slowly by her. Cindy didn't turn to look. She was used to being invisible to the wealthy people of the city. What she didn't know was that, inside the car, Edward Thompson couldn't take his eyes off her, nor off the memory of the scars he had seen on the arms of the woman the girl had mentioned. Scars he knew all too well, that haunted his nightmares for years. And so, as Cindy walked back to the shack by the riverbank, carrying the weight of failure on her small shoulders, a wheel of fate began to turn. A wheel that would forever change not only her life and her mother's, but also that of the man who now watched her leave, tormented by secrets he had long tried to bury. Edward couldn't get the image of the barefoot girl begging for help out of his mind. Sitting in the back of his Lincoln Continental, he ordered the driver to follow her from a distance, maintaining a discreet gap as she walked through the increasingly dilapidated streets of the city. The chilled air conditioning in the car couldn't diminish the heat he felt in his chest. Those scars the girl had mentioned, it couldn't be a coincidence. The fire had happened 11 years ago, but the images still haunted him. The warehouse, in flames, the screams, the smell of smoke. His father had assured him that all the victims had been properly compensated. But what if... "Stop the car!" he ordered suddenly. They were in a dangerous part of town, where shacks were piled up on the banks of a polluted river. The driver looked in the rearview mirror, worried. "Mr. Thompson, it's not safe." "I said stop." When he got out of the vehicle, the smell of sewage and garbage hit him like a punch to the gut. The girl had disappeared into a narrow alley between the shacks. Edward hesitated for only a second before following her, his Italian loafers sinking into the mud. The sound of a violent cough guided him. He stopped at the entrance to a particularly dilapidated shack where the girl had just entered. Through the half-open door, he saw the scene that would change his life forever. "Mom! Mom! Are you awake?" The girl's voice was laden with panic. A young woman was lying on a mattress on the floor, her body racked by coughing fits. Even in the dim light, Edward could see the scars on her arms, burn marks he knew all too well. "Excuse me." His voice came out weaker than he intended. The girl turned around, startled, instinctively placing herself between him and her mother. "What do you want? Please, don't hurt us." There was fear in her voice, but also determination. She would protect her mother even if it cost her own life. "I'm not going to hurt anyone. I came to help." Edward entered the shack, trying not to show his shock at the poverty of the place. "What's your name?" "Cindy," the girl replied, still distrustful. "And this is my mother, Mary." Mary. The name hit Edward like a lightning bolt. Long-buried memories surfaced. She worked at the hotel when it happened. She was one of the housekeepers his father had ordered locked in the warehouse during the surprise inspection. When the fire started, "We need to get her to a hospital," he said, approaching the mattress. The fever was evident from the sheen on Mary's skin and her ragged breathing. "We don't have any money," Cindy replied, tears returning to her eyes. "We already tried other hospitals, but they won't take her." Edward knelt beside the mattress, ignoring the dirt that stained his expensive pants. He took his cell phone from his pocket and made a quick call. "I need a private ambulance, now." While they waited, Edward observed Mary's face. Even consumed by fever, there was a dignity in her features that impressed him. How had she survived all these years? How had she raised a daughter alone after everything his family had done? The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes. The paramedics entered with professional efficiency, ignoring the dire surroundings. As they prepared Mary for transport, Cindy didn't leave her side for a second. "Can I go with her?" the girl asked, her voice small but determined. "Of course you can," Edward replied automatically. How could he separate the two? In the ambulance, Cindy held her mother's hand while the paramedics worked. Edward watched the scene, feeling a lump in his throat. The girl was no more than 10 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone much older. "Why did you decide to help?" Cindy asked suddenly, her dark eyes fixed on him. Edward hesitated. How could he explain? How to say that his family was responsible for their suffering, that the scars on Mary's arms were a direct result of his father's actions? Sometimes we need to do the right thing, he replied vaguely. At the most expensive private hospital in the city, Mary was immediately admitted. The doctors diagnosed severe pneumonia, aggravated by years of poor living conditions. She would need to stay in the hospital for several days. Edward arranged everything: the best room, the best doctors, private nurses. But when he went to fill out the admission form, something made him pause. Instead of using his real name, he registered only as Edward Silver. He didn't want Mary to know when she woke up who he really was. Cindy refused to leave her mother's room. A nurse brought in a roll-away bed and clean blankets, but the girl preferred to curl up in the armchair next to the bed, where she could hold Mary's hand. "You need to get some rest," Edward tried to reason. "I can't sleep," Cindy replied, her eyes fixed on her mother's face. "What if she needs me?" Something in the girl's simple and devastating statement made Edward sit down in the other armchair. "Then I'll stay here too." The hours of the night passed slowly. At some point, Cindy finally fell asleep, exhausted. Edward covered her with a blanket and continued his silent vigil. Watching Mary sleep, her fever now controlled by medication, he couldn't stop thinking about the past. On the day of the fire, his father had ordered the undocumented employees to be locked in the warehouse during the inspection. It was a common practice, hiding the problems, keeping up appearances. No one expected that a short circuit would turn the warehouse into an inferno in a matter of minutes. When the doors were finally opened, the smoke had already claimed several victims. Survivors, like Mary, carried marks that would never completely heal. His father made sure everything was hushed up. Settlements were paid in exchange for silence. The media received an edited version of the facts. And Edward, at the time just a young man in his early 20s, watched it all in complicit silence. Now, looking at Cindy sleeping in the armchair, he wondered how many other lives his family had destroyed in the name of profit and appearances. How many other children grew up without what they needed because their parents had been harmed by the Thompson Empire. A soft moan brought him back to the present. Mary stirred in the bed, her eyelids fluttering. She was waking up. Edward felt panic rising. He wasn't ready to face her, to see the recognition in her eyes when she realized who he was. He got up quietly and left the room, promising himself that he would return when he was prepared to face the truth. What he didn't expect was that Cindy had seen him leave. The girl opened her eyes just as the door closed, watching his departure with an expression that mixed confusion and sadness. There was something familiar about that man, something she couldn't explain. Taking an old magazine from her small backpack, Cindy looked again at the photo of Edward Thompson that she had clipped out. There was something in his eyes, a kindness that had made her believe he could help. But the man who had just left seemed burdened with guilt and secrets. What she didn't know was that her intuition was more correct than she imagined, and that the secrets Edward carried would forever change not only her life, but also her understanding of what family meant. When Mary finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Cindy leaning over her, the girl's eyes shining with suppressed tears. The soft light of the hospital room disoriented her for a moment. She was used to the darkness of the shack, to the smell of mildew and dampness. Here, everything was clean, sterile, strange. "Mom!" Cindy hugged her carefully, as if afraid of breaking her. "You've been sleeping for so long. I was so scared." Mary tried to sit up, but her whole body ached. She looked around, confused. How did we get here?" "It was him, Mom, the man from the magazine. He helped us." Before Mary could ask more, a nurse came into the room. She checked her vital signs, adjusted the IV, and asked several questions. The fever had subsided, but the pneumonia would still require days of treatment. "Mr. Silver left everything paid for and arranged," the nurse explained before leaving. "You don't need to worry about anything." "Silver," Mary murmured, her brow furrowed. Something about that name sounded wrong, like a discordant note in a familiar song. Cindy settled on the edge of the bed, eager to tell everything that had happened. She spoke about how she had run downtown, how she had entered the store and begged for help. But when she got to the part about Edward, something made her hesitate. "There's something different about him, Mom. Sometimes when he looks at you, he seems sad. And last night when I woke up, I saw him looking at your arms. At the scars." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. The scars. For years she had tried to forget that night, the heat of the flames, the desperation of being locked inside while the smoke made the air unbreathable. She remembered voices shouting outside, someone trying to break down the door. "Mom," Cindy's worried voice brought her back. "You're shaking." "It's nothing, honey." Mary forced a smile, but her mind was racing. There was something familiar about this whole story, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Outside the room, Edward paced back and forth in the hallway. He had spent the entire night in his office, going through old files, looking for information about the fire. What he found made him sick. Mary Souza, 23 years old at the time, worked as a housekeeper for 2 years, no family in the city. Moderate, burns on arms and back, settlement denied, terminated for cause a week after the accident. The last piece of information caught him by surprise. Why would a victim be fired so soon after the accident? There was a note attached to the file, handwritten by his father. "Potential problem. Maintain distance. RT." The initials of Regina Thompson, his mother, at the end of the note made his stomach churn. What did his mother have to do with this? "Son?" Edward turned around, startled. Regina Thompson was standing in the hallway, elegant as always in her designer suit. Her cold eyes assessed her son from head to toe. "What are you doing here, Mom?" "I came as soon as I found out you were financing the hospitalization of a street urchin." The last word came out like poison from her lips. "This isn't like you, Edward. What's going on?" "How did you know I was here?" "Please," Regina gave a frigid smile. "I'm your mother. I have my ways." Edward felt anger rising. Of course she had her ways. Regina Thompson always knew everything, always controlled. Everything, including, "You knew about her, didn't you, about Mary?" Regina's smile faltered for a second. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The fire, Mom. Her termination soon after." "Why?" Regina approached, lowering her voice. "Some people need to learn their place, Edward. She was creating problems, asking too many questions. Your father agreed it was for the best. She almost died in that warehouse. But she didn't die, did she? And now she's here years later, clearly trying to get more money from our family." "She didn't ask for anything. It was her daughter who—" Edward stopped speaking abruptly, realizing his mistake too late. Regina's eyes gleamed with predatory interest. "Daughter? How old is this girl?" "It doesn't matter," Edward tried to correct, but his mother was already doing the math in her head. 10 years old. The fire was 11 years ago. Regina paled slightly. "No, it can't be." Before Edward could stop her, Regina walked to the door of the room and peered through the small glass window. She observed Cindy for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. "We need to talk," she said finally, turning on her heels and walking towards the elevator. "Now." Edward followed her, feeling as if he were being dragged by an invisible current back to the past, back to the secrets his family had buried so deeply. In the empty hospital office, Regina closed the door and faced her son. Do you have any idea what you're doing? All the work we did to keep that situation under control." "What situation, Mom? What else are you hiding?" Regina sighed, suddenly, looking older. "Your father, he wasn't a perfect man, Edward. He had his moments of weakness." The implication hit him like a punch to the gut. "No, Mary was pregnant when she was fired. She tried to talk to your father, but I took care of the situation." "My God." Edward leaned against the wall, feeling the world spin. "Cindy is your half-sister, probably, but that doesn't matter now. What matters is keeping this quiet. I've already arranged for them to be transferred to another hospital, more discreet." "You what?" "It's for everyone's good, son. Think of the scandal, our reputation." Edward felt a fury he had never experienced before. "The reputation, is that all that matters to you? That girl is blood of our blood. She's proof of a betrayal, of a mistake your father made. I won't allow it to destroy everything we've built." In the hallway, Cindy had gone out to get water. She stopped. When she heard raised voices coming from the office, she approached the half-open door silently. "You can't do this, Mom. You can't just forcibly transfer them." "I can and I will. The ambulance arrives in an hour, and you, Edward, will stay away from them, or what? Or maybe I'll have to take more definitive measures." Cindy felt her blood run cold. She ran back to the room, the cup of water forgotten in her trembling hands. Her mother was sleeping again, the medication keeping her drowsy. "Mom, wake up," she whispered urgently, shaking Mary. "We need to get out of here now." But Mary only murmured something incoherent, her eyelids too heavy to open. Cindy looked in panic at the door, expecting at any moment to see Regina Thompson enter to take them away. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Edward was also making a decision that would change the course of all their lives. He wouldn't allow his mother to hurt anyone else, even if it meant facing his own family, even if it cost him his inheritance, his name, everything. The question was, could he act in time? Panic gripped Cindy as she tried, unsuccessfully, to wake her mother. The medication was too strong, keeping Mary in a deep sleep. Through the hospital room window, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange. Less than an hour until the ambulance arrived, according to what she had overheard, less than an hour to find a way out. The girl looked around the hospital room, desperately searching for something that could help. The machines beeped softly, marking her mother's heartbeats. The IV dripped slowly into Mary's vein. How could they escape with her in this state? In the hallway, voices approached. Cindy recognized Regina Thompson's cold voice and hid behind the door, her heart beating so loudly she was sure they could hear it from outside. "I want everything prepared for the transfer," Regina instructed. "Someone. No documentation, no records, understood?" "Yes, Mrs. Thompson," a male voice replied. "But what about your son? Edward is being emotional. I've arranged for him to be kept busy with an emergency at the hotels. By the time he realizes what's happened, it'll be too late." The footsteps moved away, but Cindy remained motionless, trembling. Silent tears streamed down her face as the reality of the situation hit her. There was no way she could carry her mother out of the hospital. She had nowhere to go. She had no one to help. Except Edward, she whispered to herself. He had been kind. He had helped when no one else would, and now his own mother was trying to keep him away. Carefully, Cindy cracked open the door and peeked into the hallway. It was relatively empty, just a few nurses passing by in a hurry. Gathering all her courage, the girl left the room. She needed to find Edward before it was too late. But where to start? The hospital was enormous, with several floors and endless corridors. Cindy's legs trembled as she walked, trying to look natural, as if she belonged there. Some people looked at her with curiosity, a girl alone, with clothes too simple for this luxurious hospital. At the end of the hallway, Cindy spotted the nurse who had taken care of her mother earlier. She approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mr. Edward, do you know where he is?" The nurse frowned. "Mr. Silver? I haven't seen him since—" "Silver?" A cutting voice interrupted. Regina Thompson was standing behind them, her cold eyes fixed on Cindy. "So that's how he's introducing himself?" Cindy took a step back instinctively. There was something frightening about that woman, something that went beyond her studied elegance and her expensive perfume. "Looking for my son, dear?" Regina asked, her voice too sweet. "I'm sorry, but he had to leave. Urgent business at the hotels, you understand." "Hotels?" Cindy repeated, confused. That's when it clicked. The photo in the magazine, the name Thompson. He's Edward Thompson, Regina completed with a cruel smile. Heir to the Thompson Hotels, the same hotel where your mother worked, where that terrible accident happened. The world seemed to spin around Cindy. Her mother's words, so often whispered during feverish nights, came back with full force. It was at the Thompson Hotels. They locked us in there. The fire. "I see your mother told you some stories." Regina continued, her voice low so that only Cindy could hear. "But I bet she didn't tell you everything. About your father, for example." "My father?" "Regina!" Edward's voice thundered through the hallway. He was practically running, his face red with anger. "Get away from her!" Regina turned to her son, maintaining her plastic smile. "Darling, I was just having a chat with well, let's just say with your new little friend." "That's enough!" Edward reached them in a few long strides. "It's over, Mum. I won't allow you to hurt anyone else." "Hurt?" Regina laughed, a joyless sound. "I'm protecting our family, our reputation, something you should understand." "Our family?" Edward lowered his voice, trembling with rage. "This girl is our family. She's my sister." The words hit Cindy like a lightning bolt. Her legs buckled and she would have fallen if Edward hadn't caught her arm. "What nonsense are you saying?" she asked, her voice small and scared. "It's true." Edward knelt in front of her, his eyes level with hers. "Your father, our father, don't." Regina grabbed her son's arm. "Don't you dare!" But it was too late. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in Cindy's mind. The secret visits her mother received at the hotel before the fire, the extra money that appeared mysteriously. And then the fire, the termination, the silence. "My mother," Cindy began, her voice trembling. "She was pregnant when she was fired? With me?" Edward nodded slowly. Regina let out a sound of frustration and disgust. "Great! She practically spat the words. Now that you've ruined everything, son, what do you intend to do? Split your inheritance with this innocent child you tried to push aside?" Edward finished, standing up. "Yes, I intend to. And more than that, I intend to tell the whole truth. About the fire, about how you and my father covered it all up, about how you forced Mary to leave when you found out she was pregnant." Regina's face lost all color. "You wouldn't do that." "I would and I will. Enough lies, enough secrets." "Then you leave me no choice." Regina grabbed her cell phone. "I'll have to speed things up." Before Edward could stop her, she typed something quickly. Seconds later, alarms began to blare in Mary's room. "Mom!" Cindy screamed in panic, running back to the room. Edward followed her, leaving Regina behind with her victorious smile. Inside the room, the machines beeped frantically. Mary was having seizures, her body thrashing on the bed. "What did you do?" Edward shouted at his mother, who was watching from the doorway. "Me? I didn't do anything. But you know how these medications are. Sometimes there are adverse reactions." The medical team flooded the room, pushing Cindy and Edward outside. The last thing Cindy saw was her mother, pale and trembling, before the door closed. "Please," she grabbed Edward's hand, sobbing. "Don't let her die. Please." Edward hugged his sister, against his chest. Feeling her tears soaking his shirt, he glared at his mother, who maintained that cold smile. "This isn't going to stand," he promised, his voice filled with a determination he had never felt before. "I won't allow it." Regina shrugged, adjusting her designer bag on her shoulder. "We'll see, son, we'll see." As she walked away down the hallway, her heels echoing on the marble floor, Edward knew that the real battle was just beginning. And this time, he wouldn't remain silent. He wouldn't allow his mother to hurt the only people who truly mattered. But first, he needed to save Mary. And to do that, he would have to face not only his mother, but the entire empire his family had built on lies and secrets. The minutes dragged on like hours as Edward and Cindy waited for news in the hospital hallway. The medical team remained inside Mary's room, working frantically to stabilize her. Each time the door opened, Cindy stood up hopefully, only to sit back down, devastated, when another doctor or nurse rushed past without saying anything. Edward couldn't stop pacing. His mind was racing, trying to understand how his mother could have reached this point. Regina Thompson had always been a cold, calculating woman, obsessed with appearances and social status. But trying to kill someone? That was a new level of cruelty, even for her. "Do you think she'll succeed?" Cindy's small voice brought him back to reality. The girl was curled up in the hallway chair, looking even smaller and more fragile than she really was. Succeed at what? Killing my mother? The brutal frankness of the question hit him like a punch to the gut. Edward knelt in front of Cindy, holding her small hands in his. "I'm not going to let that happen," he promised, his voice firm despite the fear he felt. "I'm going to protect both of you, no matter what." "Why?" Cindy asked, her dark eyes fixed on him. "Because I'm your sister." "Not only because of that," Edward replied after a moment of reflection, "because it's the right thing to do. Because I've allowed my family to hurt too many people already. Because—" He stopped, feeling his throat tighten. How could he explain to a 10-year-old the weight of the guilt he carried? How to say that every scar on Mary's arms was a silent accusation of his past cowardice? At that moment, the door to the room opened and a doctor came out, looking exhausted. Edward and Cindy stood up immediately. "We managed to stabilize her," the doctor said even before they asked. "But it was a close call. There was a severe reaction to the medication. It's very unusual." "Doctor," Edward interrupted, lowering his voice, "I need you to run some tests. I suspect someone may have tampered with her medication." The doctor frowned, shocked. "That would be extremely serious. We'd need to alert hospital security, launch an investigation." "Please," Edward pleaded, "tests first. Then we decide on the next steps." As the doctor reluctantly agreed and walked away, Edward felt his cell phone vibrate. It was a message from his mother. "Hospital conference room. Now, come alone." Edward looked at Cindy, who had gone back to sitting, her eyes fixed on her mother's room. "I need to take care of something," he said softly. "Will you be okay here for a few minutes?" Cindy nodded distractedly. Edward hesitated for a moment, then took off his suit jacket and placed it over her shoulders. It was a small but significant gesture, a silent promise that he would return. The conference room was on the top floor of the hospital. When Edward entered, Regina was sitting at the head of the mahogany table, looking perfectly at ease, as if she were in just another business meeting. "Sit down, son," she gestured to the opposite chair. "We have a lot to discuss." "I have nothing to discuss with you," Edward replied, remaining standing. "You tried to kill an innocent woman." "Innocent?" Regina laughed humorlessly. "That woman seduced your father, got pregnant on purpose, tried to blackmail our family." "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" Edward interrupted, his voice trembling with rage. "That she's the villain of the story. She wasn't the one who locked people in a warehouse. She wasn't the one who covered up deaths. She wasn't the one who destroyed lives to keep up appearances." Regina stood up slowly, placing her hands on the table. "Everything I've done to protect this family, our reputation, our legacy. What legacy, Mom? An empire built on lies and death? Don't be dramatic. Regina rolled her eyes. Accidents happen in every business. The difference is how you deal with them. Accidents? Edward felt bile rising in his throat. You were the one who ordered. Those people locked in, weren't you? Dad always followed your orders without question. Regina's silence was answer enough. My God, Edward ran his hands through his hair, feeling suddenly exhausted. Why do something so cruel? The inspection was coming, Regina replied, her voice strangely distant. We had undocumented employees, questionable contracts. If they found out, we'd lose everything. And when the fire started, it was a genuine accident, Regina sighed. A short circuit in the warehouse, no one could have predicted, but you didn't open the doors, Edward finished, the realization hitting him like a lightning bolt. You waited until the inspection was gone. How many minutes was it? How many people died while you protected your precious empire? Regina didn't answer, but her eyes hardened. What's done is done. Now we have to deal with the present, with this inconvenient situation. Inconvenient, Edward almost shouted. We're talking about my sister, about her mother who you tried to kill. I can still fix this, Regina said, her voice softening dangerously. We can make a deal, give them money, send them away, start over. No, Edward cut her off. Enough deals, enough lies. I'm going to tell everything, to the press, to the police, to anyone who will listen. Regina's face lost all color. You wouldn't do that. You'd destroy everything your father built. My father, Edward laughed bitterly. My father was a coward who followed your orders without question, who betrayed his own wife and then abandoned the daughter he fathered, who preferred to live with the guilt than do the right thing. And you, Regina retorted, you're no different. You knew everything, you saw everything happen, and you stayed silent all these years. The words hit him like a slap in the face, because it was true. He had been complicit with his silence, with his cowardice. You're right, he said finally. I'm no better than him, but I can change that. I can do the right thing now. Regina watched her son for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. Do you know what will happen if you do this? She asked softly. You'll lose everything. Your inheritance, your name, your position. No, Edward interrupted. I'll gain something much more important. A real family. As he turned to leave, Regina called out one last time. Edward, don't do this, please. He stopped at the door, but didn't turn around. I've already made my choice, Mom. The question is, what are you going to do now? Back in the hospital hallway, Edward found Cindy asleep in the chair, wrapped in his oversized jacket. She looked so small, so vulnerable. How could his mother want to hurt an innocent child? The doctor appeared at that moment, carrying a folder of test results. His face was grave. Mr. Thompson, he called softly, so as not to wake Cindy. We found something in the tests. The medication was definitely tampered with. Someone added, a substance. I know who it was, Edward interrupted, and I'm going to prove it. As the doctor walked away to arrange for the medication to be changed, Edward took out his cell phone. It was almost 2 a.m, but that didn't matter. He had some important calls to make. First, to his lawyer. Then, to every journalist. He knew it was time to tell the truth, no matter the cost. He looked at Cindy, sleeping peacefully, and then at the door to the room where Mary was fighting to survive. He wouldn't allow his mother to hurt them again, even if it meant destroying everything his family had built. Because some things were more important than money and power. Some things were worth any sacrifice. The sun began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky with rosy hues. A new day was dawning, And with it, a new story was about to be written. The sunrise brought with it a flood of reporters to the hospital. Edward had spent the entire night making calls, sending documents, exposing every sordid detail of the empire his family had built. The story of the fire, the covered-up deaths, the abandonment of Mary and her daughter, it all came to light like an unstoppable avalanche. Regina Thompson watched it all unfold from her penthouse office in the Thompson Hotel's building. Her face a mask of contained fury as the news spread. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Concerned shareholders, nervous business partners, journalists eager for statements. The company's stock plummeted with each new revelation. At the hospital, Cindy woke up to the noise of voices and camera flashes. Edward shielded her from the media frenzy, keeping her close as they walked through the hallway. The girl was still wearing his oversized jacket, like a kind of shield against the world. "Why are there so many people here?" she asked, gripping her brother's hand tightly. "Because it's time for the truth to come out," Edward replied softly. "No one will be able to hurt you or your mother anymore." Inside the room, Mary was finally awake. The change in medication had taken effect, and although she was still weak, her eyes were alert and aware. When she saw Edward enter with Cindy, her entire body tensed. "You..." Her voice was hoarse. "I knew there was something familiar about you." "Mom!" Cindy ran to hug her. "He helped us. He's different from them." Mary stroked her daughter's hair, but her eyes remained fixed on Edward. Years of pain and hurt reflected in that gaze. "Why now?" she asked finally. "After all this time, why did you decide to help?" Edward pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "It was time for the whole truth to come out, because I can't live with this guilt anymore," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Because every day I spent in silence was a day I betrayed. Not only you and Cindy, but also myself." He told her everything, about how he had always known about the fire, but preferred to believe his parents' edited version, about how he had only recently discovered Mary's pregnancy through the old files, about his mother's attempt to cover it all up again. "She tried to kill me?" Mary asked, incredulous. "The tests confirmed it. She tampered with your medication." Edward lowered his eyes, ashamed. "My own mother preferred to commit murder than to allow the truth to come out." Mary remained silent for a long moment, processing everything. Cindy, sitting on the edge of the bed, looked from one to the other, trying to understand the weight of those revelations. "Your father," Mary began hesitantly, "did he know about Cindy?" Edward shook his head. "I think he suspected, but he preferred to believe my mother's lies. It was easier that way." "He was never a brave man," Mary said with a sad smile. "He always let others make the difficult decisions for him." A commotion in the hallway interrupted the conversation. Raised voices approached the room. Edward stood up, instinctively placing himself between the door and his newfound family. Regina Thompson stormed in, ignoring the protests of the nurses. Her eyes, usually cold and controlled, now gleamed with a fury that bordered on madness. "Are you satisfied?" she shouted at Edward. "You've managed to destroy everything we've built. The shareholders are in a panic, the stock has plummeted, years of work thrown away because of this. Her eyes landed on Mary and Cindy, and for a moment, something akin to recognition passed across her face. Perhaps for the first time, she truly saw the people she had hurt, not just obstacles to be removed. "Mrs. Thompson," Mary spoke, her voice surprisingly firm. "After everything you've done, you still have the nerve to come here." Regina took a step towards the bed, but Edward blocked her path. "That's enough, Mom. It's over." "Over?" Regina laughed, a hysterical and chilling sound. "You don't understand, do you? This will never be over. They'll destroy everything, tarnish our name forever." "Our name is already tarnished," Edward replied sadly, Because of your cruelty, because of your father's cowardice, because of my complicit silence. The only thing I can do now is try to fix what I can." "Fix?" Regina spat the word out. "And how do you intend to do that? Dividing your inheritance with this bastard? Turning our empire into a charity case?" "Don't talk about my daughter like that." Mary tried to sit up in bed, but her legs buckled. Cindy rushed to support her mother, and at that moment something extraordinary happened. Regina Thompson, the woman who had orchestrated so many tragedies, who had manipulated so many lives, stopped. Her eyes fixed on Cindy, and for the first time, she truly saw her. The girl was the spitting image of her father when he was young, the same determined eyes, the same stubborn chin. It was impossible to deny the Thompson blood that ran in her veins. "She," Regina began, her voice faltering. "She looks so much like my father," Edward finished. "Your granddaughter, Mom. The granddaughter you tried to eliminate?" The words hit Regina like a slap. She staggered, leaning against the wall. Her entire empire of lies was collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "I just wanted to protect our family," she murmured more to herself than to the others. "I just wanted to keep everything perfect." "Family?" Mary interrupted, her voice filled with pain. "You destroyed families. You killed people. You separated a child from her father. What kind of protection is that?" Regina looked at everyone in the room, one by one. At Edward, the son she had raised to be the perfect heir, but who now confronted her with a strength she never imagined he possessed. At Mary, the woman who had survived everything she had tried to do. And at Cindy, the granddaughter who carried the Thompson blood, but also the strength and determination of her mother. She began, but the words died in her throat. At that moment, 2 police officers entered the room. Edward had called them as soon as the medication tests were completed. "Mrs. Regina Thompson," one of them said formally, "you are under arrest for attempted murder." Regina didn't resist as they put on the handcuffs. She seemed to have aged decades in a matter of minutes. Before being led away, she looked one last time at Edward. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." But it was too late for apologies. The damage had already been done. The lives had already been marked forever. As he watched his mother being taken away, Edward felt a mixture of sadness and relief. It was the end of an era, the end of a legacy of lies. Cindy approached him and took his hand. "What's going to happen now?" Edward looked at Mary, who was watching them from the bed with a complex expression on her face: fear, hope, uncertainty. "Now," he replied, gently squeezing his sister's hand, "we're going to rebuild everything, the right way this time." But as the sirens of the police car faded away, carrying Regina Thompson to face the consequences of her actions, no one in the room could imagine that the real battle was just beginning. Because some secrets are like deep roots. Even when you think you've pulled everything out, there's always something left buried, waiting for the right moment to resurface. In the days that followed Regina Thompson's arrest, a media storm descended upon the family. Newspapers, magazines, and television programs talked about nothing else. The Thompson empire, built over decades, was being exposed at its rotten foundations, revealing a story of greed, cruelty, and covered-up tragedies. Edward practically moved into the hospital, sleeping on the sofa in Mary's room, determined not to leave his newfound family alone for a moment. Cindy also refused to leave her mother's side, as if fearing that something might happen if she let her guard down. On a particularly hectic morning, while Mary slept and Cindy flipped through a book that Edward had brought for her, a nurse rushed into the room. "Mr. Thompson," she called in a low voice, "there's a lady at the reception desk. She says she needs to speak to you urgently." Edward frowned, worried. "Who is it?" "Mrs. Matilda," She says she worked at the hotels a long time ago. The name hit Edward like a lightning bolt. Matilda had been the head housekeeper at the hotels for over 30 years. She had retired shortly after the fire, so suddenly that no one questioned it at the time. "I'll go down," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He looked at Cindy, hesitant. "You can go," the girl said without taking her eyes off the book. "I'll take care of Mom." At the reception desk, a lady with white hair and an elegant posture was waiting for him. Her eyes, still alive and alert despite her age, filled with tears when she saw him. "Edward," she said softly. "How you've grown, Mrs. Matilda." He hugged her, smelling the familiar scent of lavender that always accompanied her. "Why are you here?" "Because it's time for the whole truth to come out," she replied, holding a manila envelope in her trembling hands. "Your mother didn't act alone back then." Edward led her to a more secluded area of the hospital, a small indoor garden where patients often came to sunbathe. They sat down on a stone bench, and Matilda began to speak. "I was there," she said, her voice laden with guilt. "On the day of the fire, your mother asked me to lock the warehouse door." "You?" Edward felt his stomach churn. "But why?" "Because she had something on me. Something that would make me lose everything if it came out." Matilda sighed deeply. "But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happened afterward with Mary." Edward held his breath as Matilda opened the envelope and took out some papers yellowed with age. "Your mother found out that Mary was pregnant even before—" "She told your father," she continued, "and then she set everything up." "What do you mean, set everything up?" "The theft Mary was accused of. Your mother planted the evidence. She put guest jewelry in her purse, called the police, everything planned down to the smallest detail." Edward felt his blood run in cold. "And you knew about this?" "I didn't just know." Matilda lowered her eyes, ashamed. "I helped. I was the one who put the jewelry in Mary's purse while she was busy cleaning the rooms." Tears were now streaming freely down the old woman's wrinkled face. Edward didn't know what to say, how to process this new revelation. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't live with this guilt anymore," Matilda replied, wiping her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. "And because there's more, much more." She handed the papers to Edward. They were letters, dozens of them, exchanged between Regina and various influential people in the city, all detailing plans, shady deals, ways to keep Mary away and silenced. "Your mother created an entire network," Matilda explained. "Doctors who refused to treat Mary, landlords who wouldn't rent to her, employers who rejected her, all to keep her in poverty, dependent, without the strength to fight back." Edward flipped through the letters, feeling bile rising in his throat. The methodical cruelty, the cold manipulation, all documented in black and white. "How did you get these letters?" "Your mother made me keep copies of everything. To make sure no one betrayed her, I imagine. When I retired, I took them all. With me, insurance, she thought. Little did she know that one day I would use them against her." At that moment, hurried footsteps interrupted the conversation. It was Cindy, breathless and scared. "Edward, come quick. Mum's crying. She can't—" "Stop!" He stood up immediately, but Matilda grabbed his arm. "Wait," she asked, taking another envelope out of her bag. "There's something Mary needs to see, something your mother hid from her for all these years." In the room, they found Mary, sitting on the bed, sobbing as she hugged a pillow. On the television, a news report showed old images of the hotel, the fire, the victims. "I'm sorry," she said between sobs. "I shouldn't have turned it on. But I needed to know. I needed to see." "Mom." Cindy climbed onto the bed and hugged her. Edward turned off the television and approached, followed by Matilda. Mary looked up, recognizing the former housekeeper immediately. "You!" she exclaimed, her face changing from sadness to anger. "How dare you come here?" "Mary!" Matilda took a step forward, trembling. "I came to ask for forgiveness and to bring something that belongs to you." She held out the last envelope. Mary took it with trembling hands, more out of reflex than out of choice. "They're letters," Matilda explained softly. "From Cindy's father. He wrote to you every week for months after you left. Regina intercepted them all, never allowed them to reach you." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary looked at the envelope as if it might explode at any moment. "He wrote?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "He tried to find you," Matilda continued, "but Regina had eyes and ears everywhere. When she finally found out you were pregnant, it was too late. Regina had already arranged your transfer to another city, too far away for him to reach." Mary opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Dozens of letters fell onto the bed, some already yellowed with age, others still preserved inside their original envelopes. "I'll leave you alone," Matilda said, walking towards the door. "There's a lot to process." Before she left, however, Mary called out, "Why now, after all this time?" Matilda stopped, her hand on the doorknob. Because some secrets weigh too much to carry to the grave, and because you deserve to know the truth, all of it." When the door closed, Edward, Mary, and Cindy were left in silence, looking at the letters scattered on the bed. Each envelope contained a piece of the past, a truth that could change everything or destroy what little they had managed to build. "Do you want me to read them to you?" Edward offered softly. Mary shook her head, clutching one of the letters to her chest. "No, I need to do this alone." Cindy snuggled closer to her mother, and Edward sat down in the armchair near the bed. Together, even in silence, they would face this new revelation. Because now they were a family, and families stick together, especially in the hardest times. As Mary opened the first letter, her hands still trembling, no one could predict how those words, written so long ago, would change their lives forever. With trembling hands, Mary opened the first letter. The paper was yellowed with age, but the strong, decisive handwriting was still perfectly legible. As her eyes scanned the lines, tears began to roll down her face. "My dearest Mary, it's been a week since I've been trying to find you. Regina says you quit, that you left of your own accord, but my heart refuses to believe it. Not after everything we've been through, not after all the promises we made to each other. I know I should have been stronger, have faced everyone and everything for you. But when Regina showed me the evidence of the theft, when the police showed up, forgive me for having doubted you, even for a moment. Now I know I was a fool. Please, if you are reading this, answer me. I need to know that you are okay." Mary couldn't continue. Her hands were shaking so much that the letter fell into her lap. Cindy picked it up gently and continued reading. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened on the day of the fire. Why did Regina insist so much that I travel that week? Why were the employees locked in the warehouse? Nothing makes sense, and the more I think, the more I suspect that I was manipulated like a puppet." Edward, who was watching from the armchair, felt his heart clench. His father had suspected something, but didn't have the courage to investigate further. Mary picked up another letter, this one dated 2 weeks later. "My Mary, today I discovered something terrible. The janitor finally confessed. It was Regina who gave the order to lock the doors. She knew about the inspection. She knew about the risk, and even so, I can't sleep anymore. The voices of those people trapped, screaming for help. Why didn't I do anything? Why did I allow this to happen? And now you've disappeared, taking with you a secret that I still can't understand. Regina acts strangely whenever I mention your name. Is there something I'm not seeing?" Cindy looked at her mother, her big eyes filled with questions. "The secret was me?" Mary nodded, unable to speak. She picked up another letter, this one dated the following month. "My beloved, I finally discovered the truth. A nurse from the hospital contacted me today. She said you had a checkup before you left. Mary, why didn't you tell me you were pregnant? Now I understand everything. Regina's haste to push you away, the false accusations, the speed with which everything happened. She didn't just want to get rid of you. She wanted to prevent me from knowing about our child. I'm searching every city, every hospital. I will find you, even if it takes a lifetime. Our child deserves to know their father, deserves to know that they weren't abandoned by choice. Tears were now flowing freely down everyone's faces in the room. Edward stood up and began to pace, restless. He knew, he murmured. All this time he knew about Cindy. But why did he never find us? Mary asked, her voice choked with emotion. The answer came in the next letter, dated 6 months later. My Mary, Regina 1. I don't know how, but she managed to erase all your tracks. Every clue I follow leads to a dead end. Every person who might know something refuses to speak. Today, she gave me an ultimatum. Either I stop searching, or she will make public the story of the fire, but with her version of the facts. She will incriminate you, make it seem like you had some responsibility. I can't allow your life to be destroyed even further because of me. So, with a broken heart, I will stop. Not because I want to, but because I need to protect you. You and our child, who maybe I will never meet. Know that I never stopped loving you, that every day without you is torture, that I will die with this regret, with this cowardice that prevents me from fighting until the end. Forgive me, my love. Forgive this weak man who couldn't be worthy of your love. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with decades of pain and secrets. Cindy was the first to break it. He died thinking he had abandoned us, she said, quietly. But in reality, he was trying to protect us. In the wrong way, Edward completed, his voice bitter. As always, he chose the easy way out. No, Mary interjected, surprising everyone. Each envelope held a piece of the past, a truth that could change everything or destroy what little they had managed to build. Do you want me to read it to you? Edward offered softly. Mary shook her head, clutching one of the letters to her chest. No, I need to do this myself. Cindy snuggled closer to her mother, and Edward sat down in the armchair near the bed. Together, even in silence, they would face this new revelation. Because now they were a family, and families stick together, especially in the toughest times. As Mary opened the first letter, her hands still trembling, no one could predict how those words, written so long ago, would change their lives forever. With trembling hands, Mary opened the first letter. The paper was yellowed with age, but the strong, decisive handwriting was still perfectly legible. As her eyes scanned the lines, tears began to roll down her face. My eternal Isabella, years have passed, and I still think of you every day. Of our child, who must be a little one running and playing somewhere. I hope you are well, that you have found the happiness that I wasn't able to give you. Regina is ill. The doctors say she doesn't have much time left. Maybe it's my cowardice, but I can only think that when she's gone, I can finally look for you again. I can finally try to fix my mistakes. But life has a cruel sense of irony. Yesterday, I found out that I am the one who is dying. A tumor, the doctors say. A matter of months, so this will be my last letter, my last plea for forgiveness, my last chance to say that I love you, that I have always loved you, that I die with your name on my lips and our child in my heart. If one day you read this, know that I failed not for lack of love, but for too much fear. That I carry with me the weight of every wrong choice, of every moment I didn't fight as I should have. Edward, my son, if by some miracle you find these letters, seek out your sister, give her all the love I couldn't give, be the man I wasn't. With all my love and regret, Roberto. When Mary finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Cindy hugged her mother tightly, as if wanting to protect her from all the pains of the past. Edward stood by the window, his back shaking with suppressed sobs. "He loved you," he said finally, turning to Mary. "In the wrong way, in the cowardly way, but he loved you." "I know," she replied softly. "I always knew." At that moment, something changed in the room, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Not that the pain had disappeared. Some wounds are too deep to heal completely. But now there was understanding. There was forgiveness. "What do we do now?" Cindy asked, her voice small but determined. Edward approached the bed, sitting on the edge. He took Mary's hand and Cindy's hand in his. "Now," he said with a conviction he had never felt before, "we do what my father couldn't. We fight together." The letters scattered across the bed were more than just pieces of paper. They were bridges between the past and the present, between the choices they couldn't change and the ones they could still make. And that night, 3 people wounded by life began to understand that sometimes you need to relive the pain to finally begin to heal. The days that followed the discovery of the letters were days of profound transformation for everyone. Mary, stronger every day, was beginning to prepare to be discharged from the hospital. The doctors were pleased with her recovery, although they recommended continued treatment and plenty of rest. Edward spent every free moment reorganizing his life and the hotels. Regina's arrest had left a power vacuum that needed to be filled, and he was determined to do things differently this time. In the meetings with the shareholders, his stance was firm and clear. "The Thompson hotels need a complete overhaul," he declared at a particularly tense meeting, "not just in management, but in their fundamental values." "But that could cost millions," one of the oldest shareholders protested. "We've already lost so much with this scandal." "We lost because we built our success on lies and suffering," Edward replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "Now it's time to rebuild the right way." He then presented his plan, a complete restructuring of the company, starting with a compensation fund for all the victims of the fire and their families. Each case would be reviewed, each story heard, each injustice recognized and repaired. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Cindy had become a constant presence not only in her mother's room, but throughout the floor. The nurses were charmed by her sweetness, and she often helped to distribute snacks and water to other patients. "She has a natural gift for caring for people," one of the nurses commented to Mary. "Just like her mother." Mary watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Cindy was stronger, more confident, but there were still times when she caught her looking at her father's letters with an expression of deep sadness. On a particularly quiet afternoon, while they were organizing things for the hospital discharge, Cindy asked the question she had been holding in for days. "Mom, do you think he would have loved me? My father?" Mary stopped what she was doing and sat down on the bed, pulling her daughter close. "He already loved you, honey, even without knowing you, even without knowing if you were a boy or a girl. It's in all the letters." "But what if—" Cindy hesitated, biting her lip. "What if he had been disappointed with what I am? A poor girl who lived in a shack who had to beg for money." "Cindy," Edward interrupted from the doorway, where he was standing without them noticing. "Our father made a lot of mistakes, but one thing I know, he would have been very proud of you." He approached the bed, sitting down on the other side of Cindy. "You know why? Because you have something he never had. Courage. Courage to ask for help when your mother needed it. Courage to trust a stranger. Courage to face everything you've faced being so young." Cindy hugged her brother, letting the tears she had held back for so long finally fall. "But now I don't need to be brave alone anymore, right?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "No," Edward confirmed, extending his arm to include Mary in the hug. "Now we're a family. We face everything together." The moment was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Matilda, carrying an old box in her arms. "Excuse me for intruding," she said timidly, "but I found some more things that you need to see." Inside the box were old photos of the hotel, documents, and a small diary. Matilda handed the diary to Mary with trembling hands. "It belonged to Roberto. I found it when I was cleaning his office after he passed away." Mary opened the diary with careful reverence. The pages were filled with the same strong handwriting as the letters, but here the words were more intimate, more raw. "March 25th, she read aloud. "Today I saw a little girl in the park. She must be the age my daughter would be. I couldn't help but imagine. Does she look like Isabella? Does she have my eyes, my smile?" Regina noticed my distraction and made a point of reminding me of our agreement. "As if I could forget." Cindy moved closer to her mother, her eyes fixed on the yellowed pages. "June 12th, Mary continued. "The doctor confirmed it today. The tumor is growing. There's not much to do. Regina acts as if it's an inconvenience. More worried about the succession of the hotels than my health. I can't stop thinking about everything I haven't done, about all the times I chose the easy way out. My daughter is out there somewhere, growing up without a father, and it's all my fault." Edward stood up abruptly, walking to the window. His father's words were like knives, each one revealing more of the pain he carried in silence. "There's more," Matilda said softly. She took a sealed envelope out of the box, addressed to Edward. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a USB drive. "My son," he began to read, "if you are reading this, it means that I failed to fix my mistakes in life. On this USB drive is everything, every document, every proof of Regina's manipulation, every penny diverted to keep people silent. I kept it as insurance, as a way to protect Isabella and our daughter if I ever found them. Now that responsibility passes to you. Use this wisely, not for revenge, but for justice, to give your sisters the life they deserve, the one I should have given them, and more importantly, be the man I wasn't. Love without fear, fight without hesitation, do what's right even when it's hard. I love you, son, and I love your sisters, even though I've never met them. I hope that one day you can forgive me, Dad." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Cindy was the one who finally broke it. "He tried," she said simply. "In the end, he tried to do the right thing. But it was too late," Edward completed bitterly. "It's never too late for the truth," Mary interjected, her voice soft but firm. "Look at us now. Who would have thought we'd be here together after everything?" Matilda watched the scene with tears in her eyes. "You are the redemption that Roberto sought so much. Proof that even from the greatest tragedies, something good can be born." Edward looked at the USB drive in his hands. There was all the power his father never had the courage to use, all the evidence necessary to not only ensure justice for his family, but to completely transform the legacy of the Thompsons' hotels. "What are you going to do?" Cindy asked, watching her brother intently. Edward smiled, a smile that mixed determination and hope. "I'm going to do what our father should have done a long time ago," he replied. "I'm going to tell the whole truth, and then we're going to rebuild everything together." But as everyone agreed, no one could imagine that the truth stored on that small USB drive was even more explosive than anyone could suspect, and that its revelations would change not only their lives, but the entire destiny of the Thompsons' hotels. When Edward finally connected the USB drive to the computer in his office at the hotel, he wasn't prepared for the magnitude of the revelations he would find. Meticulously organized files, dated and categorized, revealed much more than just the fire and its aftermath. They showed a decades-long pattern of manipulation, blackmail, and cruelty, orchestrated by Regina Thompson. "My God," he murmured, as he read document after document. It wasn't just Mary. There were dozens of other victims, other families destroyed to maintain the Thompson empire. His phone rang, interrupting his reading. It was his lawyer. "Edward, we have a problem." The voice on the other end sounded strained. "Regina is demanding to speak with you. She says she has something important to reveal, something that could change everything." "I don't want to hear any more lies from her," Edward replied, tired. "She mentioned another fire before the one you know about." Edward felt his blood run cold. He quickly opened a folder on the USB drive dated 20 years ago. There it was, another fire, at another hotel in the chain, completely covered up by the media. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, hanging up the phone. At the hospital, Mary was finishing packing her things for discharge. Cindy was helping her, carefully folding the few clothes they had. "Where are we going, Mom?" the girl asked, trying to hide the worry in her voice. They didn't have the shack anymore. The last heavy rain had washed it away. "Edward offered us an apartment," Mary replied softly. "But I don't know if we should accept. We've put him through so much already." "He's family," Cindy replied with the simplicity and wisdom that only children possess. "And family takes care of each other." Before Mary could answer, Matilda rushed into the room, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, turning on the television in the room. On the screen, Regina Thompson was giving an exclusive interview directly from prison. Her face, normally impeccable, showed signs of weariness, but her eyes still gleamed with that cold determination. "Yes, I made mistakes," she was saying to the reporter, "but everything I did was to protect my family. Edward needs to understand. There are secrets that need to remain buried, for everyone's sake." "What secrets would those be?" the reporter asked. Regina smiled, that calculated smile that Edward knew so well. "Let's just say that the fire everyone knows about wasn't the first, and that Roberto Thompson wasn't the man everyone thought he was." Mary sat down heavily on the bed, her legs weak. "What does she mean by that?" "I don't know," Matilda replied, twisting her hands nervously. "But there's something in the old files, something I never fully understood." At the police station, Edward found his mother in a private room. Regina seemed smaller without her perfect makeup and designer clothes, but her gaze was still sharp as a blade. "Finally decided to visit me," she said with a wry smile. "Did you find the USB drive your father left?" Edward sat down opposite her. "How do you know about that?" "Because I knew everything that happened in that house, son, including about the other fire, the one your father caused." "What are you talking about?" Regina leaned forward, lowering her voice. 20 years ago, even before you were born, there was another fire at the first hotel in the chain. Roberto was desperate. The hotel was going bankrupt. The creditors were threatening to take everything. So he had an idea, an accidental fire. The insurance would pay everything. Edward felt his stomach churn. "You're lying." "I'm many things, son, but I'm not a liar. It's all documented. In the files your father kept, in the evidence he held against me. Only he didn't realize that that evidence also incriminated him." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you need to understand," Regina replied, her voice softening. "Everything I did was to protect our family. Roberto was weak. I had to be strong. When I found out about Mary, about the pregnancy, I couldn't allow her to destroy everything we had built." "Built on lies and death," Edward retorted bitterly. "Built on sacrifice," Regina corrected. "Every decision I made, every person I pushed away, was to guarantee your future, the future of the Thompsons. And what about Cindy's future, my sister, your granddaughter, whom you condemned to poverty?" Regina was silent for a moment, something akin to regret passing through her eyes. Maybe I went too far, she admitted finally. But I can't change the past. I can only warn you about what you're about to discover, which would be, if you expose the truth about the first fire, it won't just be my reputation that will be destroyed. It will be the entire legacy of the Thompsons, including yours. Edward stood up, feeling the weight of each revelation on his shoulders. Mom, you still don't get it. I don't care about legacies or reputations. I care about doing the right thing. As he left the police station, his phone rang again. It was Mary. Edward, her voice was strained. There's something I need to tell you, something I found among my mother's old things. What is it? A photo of the Thompsons' first hotel. My mother worked there at the time of the fire. She didn't survive. Edward stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, feeling the world spin. You mean? Yes, Mary replied, her voice trembling. Regina wasn't the only one with secrets. When I started working at the hotel years later, it was to find out the truth about my mother's death. That's how I met your father. The pieces were starting to fall into place, a macabre puzzle of interconnected tragedies, buried secrets that refused to stay in the past. Come here, Edward asked. We need to talk, all of us. At the hospital, Cindy watched her mother hang up the phone with trembling hands. Are you okay, Mom? Mary pulled her daughter into a tight hug. It's going to be okay, honey. Now that the truth is coming out, it's going to be okay. But as she hugged her daughter, Mary couldn't avoid the fear that was growing in her chest, because some truths are like poison. Even in small doses, they can destroy everything they touch. And the truth that was about to be revealed had the power to change not only the present, but also the entire past they thought they knew. Edward's office was silent except for the soft sound of rain hitting the window. Mary, newly discharged from the hospital, was sitting in one of the leather armchairs, her hands holding an old yellowed photograph. Cindy was by her side, her wide eyes fixed on the image of a woman she never knew, her grandmother. Maria. Aparecida dos Santos, Mary said softly, caressing the face in the photograph. My mother worked as a housekeeper at the Thompsons' first hotel. She was young, beautiful, dreamy, until that night. Edward approached, observing the photo carefully. The woman had the same eyes as Mary, the same gentle smile he now saw in Cindy. Why did you never tell me? He asked softly. In the beginning, when I started working at the hotel, it was just to investigate. I wanted to understand how my mother had died, why the fire happened. Mary took a deep breath, her words heavy with years of pent-up pain. But then I met your father, and everything changed. How? Cindy asked, her voice small but curious. Roberto was different back then. Or maybe I just wanted to believe he was, Mary continued. He noticed me right away. He said there was something familiar about me. Of course there was. I was the spitting image of my mother at the same age. Edward sat down in his chair, feeling the weight of each revelation like a physical blow. You approached him on purpose. In the beginning, yes, Mary admitted, but then we truly fell in love. And I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the past could be left behind. But Regina found out, Edward completed. Not just about us. She found out who I was, where I came from, and that's when she started threatening me. Mary took another envelope from her bag, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were old documents, newspaper clippings carefully preserved. Your mother didn't act alone back then, she said, spreading the papers on the table. The first fire, it was planned by Roberto and Regina together. Edward picked up one of the clippings. It was a small note about the fire, buried in the inside pages of a local newspaper. Tragedy at luxury hotel, leaves 3 dead, read the headline. 3 dead? His voice failed. But in the official records, there were no deaths. Mary completed bitterly. Regina took care of that, just like she took care of everything afterward. My mother, Cindy began hesitantly, she was one of the... Yes, Mary pulled her daughter close, kissing her forehead. Your grandmother was there that night, along with 2 other housekeepers. They found out something they shouldn't have. What? Edward could barely ask the question. Documents, proof that the hotel was going bankrupt, that Roberto had taken out illegal loans. They needed insurance money, but for that, they needed an accident, Edward completed, feeling sick. Mary nodded sadly. Regina found out that the housekeepers knew, so she and Roberto, Her voice failed, the tears now running freely down her face. Cindy hugged her tighter, as if wanting to protect her from the painful memories. They locked the doors, Edward completed, remembering his mother's words in prison. Just like they did years later, in the other fire. History repeated itself, Mary agreed, because Regina never changed her methods, because Roberto never had the courage to face her, because some people think that money and power are worth more than human lives. Edward stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The rain had intensified, turning the city into a grey blur. When you found out you were pregnant, he began, his voice hoarse. I realized I was repeating history, Mary completed. Falling. In love with a man who had helped kill my mother, carrying his child, just like my mother was carrying me when she died. But Regina didn't know that when she pushed you away, Edward realized. She only found out later, didn't she? Yes, and when she did, Mary shuddered at the memory. That's when the real persecution began. It wasn't just about hiding the pregnancy. It was about erasing any connection to the past, any proof of what they had done. Cindy, who had remained silent, absorbing every word, finally spoke. Is that why we lived hidden? Why we could never stay in the same place for long? Mary hugged her daughter tightly. Forgive me, honey. I just wanted to protect you. Regina had eyes everywhere, and I knew that if she found us, she would have done anything to silence us, Edward completed, turning to them, like she tried to do at the hospital. A heavy silence fell over the office, broken only by the steady sound of the rain. Each person lost in their own thoughts, trying to process the weight of so many revelations. What do we do now? Cindy asked finally, her voice small but determined. Edward looked at the documents scattered on his desk. The evidence of the first fire, his father's letters, the files on the USB drive. So many secrets, so many lies, so many lives destroyed. Now, he said with a firmness he didn't feel, we honor the memory of your grandmother and of all the other victims. We tell the truth, the whole truth. But that will destroy everything, Mary warned. The hotels, the Thompson name. Maybe it's time to destroy, Edward replied softly. To build something new, something clean. At that moment, his phone rang. It was his lawyer again. Edward. The voice on the other end sounded urgent. Regina is asking to see you again. She says she has one more revelation, something about the night of the first fire, something that no one else knows. Edward looked at Mary and Cindy, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. More secrets, more painful truths to be revealed. Tell her I'm coming, he replied finally. But this time, I'm not going alone. As he gathered the documents into his briefcase, Edward knew they were about to open the last door, to reveal the last secret, and that after that, nothing would ever be the same again. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the city as if wanting to cleanse decades of lies and tragedies. It was time for the final truth to come out, no matter how painful it might be. The trip to the police station was silent. Edward drove focused, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at Mary and Cindy in the back seat. The rain continued to fall, turning the streets into rivers and blurring the car windows. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked Mary for the third time since they left the office. "You don't have to face her." "I need to," Mary replied softly. "For my mother, for all the other victims who never had a voice." Cindy held her mother's hand tightly, her big eyes revealing a mixture of fear and determination. She was still carrying the old photo of her grandmother in her coat pocket, a silent reminder of why they were there. When they arrived at the police station, they were greeted by Edward's lawyer, who was waiting for them at the entrance. "She's different today," he warned as he led them through the corridors, more agitated, as if she knows this is the end. Regina Thompson was in the same room as before, but something about her had changed. Her face, normally a mask of control, showed signs of weariness and something else, fear, perhaps. When she saw Mary enter with Edward and Cindy, her eyes widened slightly. "So this is it?" she said with a bitter smile. "Brought the whole family to listen to the final confession?" "Enough games, Mom," Edward replied, sitting down. "You wanted to tell us something about the first fire. We're here to listen." Regina looked intently at Mary, then at Cindy. Her eyes lingered on the girl, as if finally allowing herself to see the resemblances to Roberto. "Your mother," she began, addressing Mary. "Maria Aparecida. I knew her well before that night." Mary felt her heart race. "What do you mean?" "She worked for me, not just at the hotel. She took care of my house too on the weekends," Regina continued, her voice taking on a distant tone, as if reliving long-buried memories. "She was a good woman, honest, maybe too honest." "What are you getting at?" Edward pressed. "She discovered more than just the financial problems of the hotel," Regina replied, closing her eyes for a moment. "She found out about Roberto's other dealings, the illegal ones." A heavy silence fell over the room. Edward felt his stomach churn. "What other dealings?" "Your father. He wasn't just a bankrupt businessman trying to save his hotel," Regina continued. "He had connections with dangerous people, people who loaned money in exchange for favors. The hotel, it was used to launder that money." Mary brought her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "My mother found out about this." Regina nodded slowly. "She found the real accounting books. She threatened to report everything to the police. She was naive. She thought she was doing the right thing." "So you killed her," Edward completed, his voice trembling with rage. "No," Regina replied quickly, something akin to remorse crossing her face. "It wasn't supposed to happen. The fire, it was just supposed to destroy the evidence, scare the employees. But something went wrong." "What went wrong?" Cindy asked suddenly, her voice small but firm. Regina looked at her granddaughter as if seeing her for the first time. For a moment, her mask of coldness completely fell away. "The fire, it spread faster than we expected. Roberto had doused some areas with fuel to make sure the documents would be destroyed. But we didn't know. We didn't know that Maria was pregnant, that she wouldn't be able to run as fast." Mary let out a distressed sound, the tears now running freely down her face. Cindy hugged her, her own eyes welling up. "When we realized there were people trapped," Regina continued, her voice now almost a whisper. "Roberto wanted to open the doors, but I stopped him." "Why?" Edward asked, although he already knew the answer. "Because they knew too much. And if they survived, if they told, it wouldn't just be the hotel we would lose. Roberto would go to jail. I would be alone, pregnant." Regina put her hand over her mouth as if trying to stop the words from coming out. "You were in my womb, Edward. I had just found out I was pregnant. I couldn't allow it." The impact of the revelation hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He had been there, in a way, on the night it all began. His very existence had been part of the justification for those deaths. After that, Regina continued, her voice now firmer, I swore I would do anything to protect our family. When Mary appeared years later, when I realized who she was, history couldn't repeat itself. So you persecuted me, Mary completed. You tried to destroy me, just like you destroyed my mother. I tried to remove the threat, Regina corrected. But you were stubborn, like her. And Roberto, he fell in love with you, just like he fell in love with your mother. Edward stood up abruptly, unable to remain seated. Wait, what? Regina let out a humorless laugh. Haven't you figured it out yet? Roberto and Maria, they were having an affair. She was pregnant with him when she died. The revelation landed like a bomb in the room. Mary felt the world spin around her. You mean that? Yes, Regina confirmed. You are Roberto's daughter, Mary, just like Edward, just like your daughter is his granddaughter twice over. Cindy looked from her mother to Edward, trying to process what that meant. So you guys are siblings? That's why I couldn't let you get close to him again, Regina said to Mary. That's why I had to be so definitive. The truth couldn't come out. I couldn't allow history to repeat itself. Edward staggered to the wall, leaning against it to avoid falling. His entire life, his entire family history, was an even bigger lie than he imagined. Why are you telling us this now? He asked finally. Because I'm dying, Regina replied simply. The same cancer that took Roberto. I have weeks, maybe less, and I can't die with this. The silence that followed was deafening. Each person in the room lost in their own thoughts, trying to process the weight of those revelations. What do we do now? Cindy asked again, her voice trembling slightly. Mary pulled her daughter closer, kissing her forehead. Now, honey, we honor the memory of all those we lost, and we try to build something new from the ashes of the past. Edward looked at his mother, the woman who had caused so much pain, but who also, in a twisted way, had tried to protect her family in the only way she knew how. Is it all in the documents? He asked. All the evidence? Regina nodded, slowly. On the USB drive, in the old files, Roberto kept everything. Maybe he knew that one day the truth would need to come out. As they left the police station, the rain had finally stopped. A faint rainbow was forming on the horizon, as if nature wanted to offer some solace after so many painful revelations. Home? Edward asked softly, looking at Mary and Cindy. Home, Mary affirmed, squeezing her daughter's hand. To our home. As they drove back, each lost in their own thoughts, they knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, something new could be born from the pain of these revelations. Something true. The days that followed Regina's revelations were a time of profound transformation for everyone. Edward turned one of the hotel's most spacious suites into a temporary home for Mary and Cindy, insisting that they needed a comfortable place to process everything that had happened. Mary initially resisted, feeling uneasy with so much luxury after years of living in poverty. But seeing how Cindy was captivated by the large, light-filled room, with its view of the city stretching to the horizon, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. It's so different from the shack, Cindy commented one morning as they had coffee. On the balcony, sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it was all a dream. Mary hugged her daughter, kissing her hair. It's not a dream, sweetheart, but it's not a fairy tale either. We still have a lot to process, a lot to understand. The truth in Mary's words echoed in every moment of the day. The discovery that they were all much more connected than they imagined, not just by tragedy, but by blood, had fundamentally changed the dynamic between them. Edward spent every free moment with his newfound family. It was strange and yet natural to think of Mary as his sister, In a way, it explained the instant connection he felt with her and Cindy from the first moment. "How are you coping with all this?" he asked Mary one night while Cindy was asleep in the next room. Mary gazed out the window for a long time before answering. "It's like my whole life has been rewritten. Every memory, every moment, everything has a new meaning now." "Do you think he knew, our father, about you?" "I think he suspected," Mary replied softly. "In the letters, especially the last ones, there was something, a guilt that went beyond the affair with my mother." Edward took her hand, squeezing it gently. It was a simple gesture, but laden with meaning, a silent promise that she wasn't alone anymore. At the hospital, Regina worsened with each passing day. The cancer, aggressive and already at an advanced stage, consumed her strength quickly. Even so, she refused to receive visits from anyone but Edward. "How are they doing?" she asked one particularly difficult afternoon, her voice weak and hoarse. "Well," Edward replied simply, "adapting." "Mary, she's so much like her mother," Regina commented, her gaze distant. "Same strength, same determination. That's why I was so afraid." "Afraid of what, Mom?" "That she would find out everything, that you would find out. Of losing the control I took so long to build." Edward watched his mother, so small now in the hospital bed, so different from the powerful and intimidating woman she had been. "You know what's ironic?" he said finally. "All this control, all these manipulations, in the end, they only serve to separate us even more." Regina closed her eyes, a solitary tear running down her face. "I just wanted to protect you," she whispered. "From the past, from the truth, from everything that could hurt. But in the process, I became the biggest threat." Meanwhile, in the hotel offices, Edward worked tirelessly on the complete restructuring of the company. With the help of his legal team, he began to locate all the victims of the two fires and their families. "We can't undo the past," he explained at a meeting with the shareholders, "but we can try to correct some wrongs." He created a compensation fund, using a large portion of his personal inheritance. Each family would receive not only financial compensation, but also continued medical and psychological support. Cindy, surprisingly, became a fundamental part of this process. Her natural sensitivity and her own experience as an indirect victim made her especially empathetic in dealing with other families. "You have a gift, you know that?" Edward commented one day, watching her comfort the daughter of one of the victims of the first fire, for helping people feel heard, understood. "I learned it from Mom," Cindy replied with a shy smile. "She always said that shared pain weighs less." One afternoon, while they were organizing the documents for another round of compensations, Matilda appeared in the office. Her eyes were red from crying. "Regina, she wants to see all of you," she said simply. "The doctors say she won't make it through the night." The silence that followed the announcement was heavy with decades of unresolved history. Edward looked at Mary, who instinctively hugged Cindy close. "We don't have to go," he said softly. "No one would expect that from you, after everything." Mary closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a calm determination in her gaze. "No," she replied, "we need to go, not for her, but for us, to close this chapter once and for all." At the hospital, they found Regina in a semi-conscious state. The cancer had consumed her body, but her eyes still held that characteristic glint of intelligence. When she saw Mary and Cindy entering the room with Edward, a sob escaped her lips. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "For everything." Mary approached the bed, Cindy holding her hand tightly. "We didn't come seeking forgiveness," she said softly. "We came to say goodbye, and maybe understand a little more." Regina extended a trembling hand towards Cindy. The girl hesitated for a moment, looking at her mother, who nodded slightly. When Cindy took her grandmother's hand, Regina began to cry for real, not calculated tears as so often before, but genuine tears of regret and loss. "You have his eyes," she said to Cindy. "The same eyes Roberto had when he was young, the same eyes as your grandmother, Maria." Edward approached as well, completing the family circle around the bed. It was a scene he never imagined possible, all united not by love or forgiveness, but by a profound understanding that some stories need to be closed so that others can begin. "Take care of them," Regina asked Edward, her voice growing weaker. "Do what your father and I never did. Love without fear, protect without destroying." Those were her last words. Regina Thompson passed away that night, taking with her decades of secrets and manipulations, but also leaving behind a chance for a fresh start. As they left the hospital, the night was clear and starry. Cindy looked up at the sky, still holding her mother's and uncle's hands. "What now?" she asked, her voice small but full of hope. Edward and Mary exchanged a meaningful look. There was so much to do, so much to rebuild. But now, finally, they could do it together, as the family they were always meant to be. "Now," Edward replied, "we begin our own story." A year had passed since the night Regina Thompson passed away. Time, as always, brought with it profound changes and healed some wounds, although others remained as silent marks of a past that would never be forgotten. The Thompson hotels had undergone a complete transformation. Edward, with the unconditional support of Mary, turned the chain into an example of social responsibility. The compensation fund for the victims of the fires had grown, benefiting not only the directly affected families, but also creating aid programs for people in vulnerable situations. Cindy, now 11 years old, blossomed like a flower after the storm. She attended one of the best schools in the city, where she excelled not only in her studies, but mainly in her ability to help others. She had a special gift for comforting classmates who were going through difficulties, using her own story as an example that there is always hope. One particularly significant morning, Edward found Mary on the balcony of the apartment that was now truly a home for all of them. She was watching Cindy in the hotel garden, where the girl had created a small gardening project with other children from the neighborhood. "Sometimes I still don't believe it," Mary commented softly, "in how everything changed in so little time." Edward smiled, handing her a cup of coffee. "It changed because it was time, because we finally made the right choices." In the garden, Cindy was patiently explaining to a group of children how to care for the seedlings they had planted. They were children of hotel employees, of neighborhood residents, some even from families that had been affected by the fires. For her, there was no difference. Everyone deserved the chance to see something beautiful grow. "You know what impresses me most about her?" Edward commented, watching his niece with pride, "how she managed to transform all the pain she lived through into something positive." "She has that gift," Mary replied, her eyes shining with emotion, "of seeing beauty where others would only see ashes." The hotel, which was once a symbol of tragedy and secrets, now pulsed with new life. The formerly cold and impersonal corridors were decorated with works by local artists. The old warehouse, where so many lives were lost, had been transformed into a community center, offering courses and opportunities for people who, like Mary and Cindy once, needed a chance. "Mom! Uncle Edward!" Cindy called from the garden, waving animatedly. "Come see, the first flowers are blooming." When they went down to the garden, they found not only flowers, but a small miracle growing. Among the carefully planted seedlings, a flower that no one had sown was blooming, a white lily, just like the ones Maria Aparecida, Mary's mother, used to grow at the old hotel. "It was her favorite flower," Mary whispered, kneeling next to her daughter. Your grandmother always said that lilies are a symbol of rebirth. Cindy delicately touched the white petals. Do you think it's a sign that she's watching us? That she's proud? I'm sure she is, sweetheart, Mary replied, hugging her daughter. Not just her, but everyone we lost is seeing how we transformed their story into something beautiful. Edward watched the scene with a full heart. In 1 year, he had gained much more than a sister and a niece. He had gained a true family. He had learned that blood ties are important, but it is the ties built with love, forgiveness, and understanding that truly define a family. In the hotel offices, a new plaque had been installed in the main lobby. On it, the names of all the victims of the 2 fires were engraved in golden letters. It wasn't just a memorial, but a constant reminder that every life matters, every story deserves to be told. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, the family gathered for a special moment. Edward had prepared a surprise that he had been planning for months. I have something for you, he said, handing an envelope to Mary. Inside were documents, the deed to a plot of land near the hotel, architectural plans, designs. What's this? Mary asked, confused. It's the future, Edward replied with a smile. We're going to build a support center for families in vulnerable situations, with temporary housing, daycare, vocational courses, everything you didn't have when you needed it. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she read the details of the project. And the best part, Edward continued, now looking at Cindy, is that your idea for the garden will be the heart of the project. Each family will have their own space to plant, to see beautiful things grow while they rebuild their lives. Cindy hugged her uncle tightly, unable to contain her emotion. Is it going to be called the Maria Aparecida Garden? Yes, Edward confirmed, returning the hug. In honor of your grandmother, who even without knowing it, planted the seeds of all this. That night, as they ate dinner together, as they did every day now, the conversation flowed naturally, full of plans for the future. It wasn't a luxurious meal in a grand mansion, as Regina had always dreamed for her family. It was something much more valuable. It was real, honest, built on foundations of truth and love. You know what I learned this past year, Cindy said, suddenly surprising the adults with her wisdom. That sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters. Mary and Edward exchanged an emotional look. It was true. They had lost so much along the way. A mother, a father, fortune, status, appearances, but they had gained something much more precious, the chance to be truly happy. And you know what else? Cindy continued, her face lit up by a smile. Now I know that family isn't just who has the same blood. It's who chooses to stay together even after the storm passes. Edward raised his glass in a silent toast. Before him were not only his sister and his niece, it was his redemption, his chance to make a difference, his true legacy. The sun had completely set, but the apartment was illuminated not only by the lights, but by the warmth of 3 hearts that had learned that true love is stronger than any secret, than any pain, than any past. In the garden below, the white lily shone under the moonlight, as a silent reminder that even from the greatest tragedies something beautiful can be born. It was the perfect symbol for that family that had been reborn from the ashes, not only of the fire, but of decades of lies and pain. And so, as the city slept around them, 3 people whom fate had separated and then reunited in such an improbable way knew that they had finally found their place in the world. Not in luxurious mansions or fortunes, but in the simple and true love that they had built together. The future was open before them, full of possibilities. And for the first time in their lives, none of them were afraid of tomorrow. Because now they knew that no matter what came, they would face it together, as a family, as it always should have been.